Hey guys, this is Dave, and I have Aful's new flagship IEM, the Dawn X. Their previous flagship, of course, was the Cantor, and that is an $800 14 balanced armature set. The Dawn X jumps up in price quite a bit, up to $1,300, and also has 14 drivers, but it changes the configuration from an all BA setup to a full-on quad brid configuration. So you've got one dynamic driver, 8 BAs, and then 4 ESTs, and then also one bone conduction driver. And then of course, it also implements some other pretty impressive crossover technologies. And then they've combined that with what they're calling 3D micro resonance acoustic path technology, plus more. Point being, the Dawn X has a lot of really interesting stuff going on. But at $1,300, this is going a little beyond that kilobuck category, and it's approaching IEMs like the Diva and the IA900, the Helios. So the competition starts to get a little crazy at this price point, and expectations are going to be pretty high. But again, this is Aful we're talking about, and if there's one thing we know about Aful, it's that they shouldn't be underestimated. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. Okay, so this is everything that you get in the box. And I have to say, while I do think, I guess it's reasonably accessorized, when I initially opened the box and I kind of started going through everything, I think I was just expecting maybe a little more, like maybe a cleaning cloth and maybe even a modular cable with some other termination options. So I was kind of digging through the box to see if there was something I missed, and this was everything. And it's pretty much the same accessories that were included with the Cantor. So you have the IEMs and cable. This is a 4.4 cable, but there is a 3.5 option available at checkout. It has a cable strap. It also comes with a very nice large case. Again, the same case that was included with the Cantor. You then have 4 kinds of ear tips in their own little containers and a cleaning tool. And I just realized I don't have that on the table. But it is reasonably appointed, I guess. And it does come with everything that you need. Maybe just not everything you'd want. That is a very minor nitpick, because personally, I'm more concerned about quality at this price point. And the Dawn X definitely brings that to the table. So let's start with IEMs themselves. If you look at the faceplate, you'll see they've opted for this stabilized wood with a resin blend. And we've seen this before with the SA6 lineup, the Da Vinci, and a few others, but this deep red color is really different in my opinion. And hopefully I can catch all the details in my B-roll, but I have to say, the depth and the dimension with the resin mixed with the wood grain really is quite stunning in person. And then the high gloss coating, it just finishes everything off very nicely. As for the shell size, it does have to house a lot of drivers, so you might expect that it's pretty thick. That said, I do think they did a good job at shaping and contouring the inside of the shells, because it does rest pretty comfortably against my ears, which again, that is something that's very important since this uses the BC drivers. So you will need to get a pretty deep fit so that the insides of the shells are resting properly against the insides of your ears. And that may require some tip rolling on your end. I ended up actually using my Elastec tips, and the velvet tips, the Divinus velvet tips did do a good job as far as me getting a nice snug fit up against the concha part of my ear. However, they did have a tendency to kind of slowly start to slip off the nozzle. In any case, again, I would definitely recommend trying different tips. And also, again, for those of you that have smaller ears, just be aware these shells are on the larger side. So if you have a history of having fit issues with larger shells, again, that's definitely something you may want to consider. And again, each of these shells house 14 drivers. You have one dynamic driver, 8 BAs, 4 ESTs, and then one bone conduction driver. And I don't want to spend too much time on specs, but if you're curious about all of the engineering, and there's a lot that went into these, I would definitely encourage you to head over to the product page and check all that out. I do want to quickly mention, though, the crossover, because it's a combination of both a 6-way electronic crossover and a 6-way physical crossover. And when you're dealing with this many drivers and this many types of drivers, you can imagine how challenging that it might be trying to achieve good cohesion and phase alignment. And I don't claim to be an expert, but I know that it's not easy, especially when you have a configuration like this. And again, if you want to know more, I would definitely head over to the product page and check that out. And I'll make sure I link that in the description. Now, back to the design though. The faceplate design is absolutely stunning, and the overall quality of the earpieces and the finishes of the earpieces, it's just excellent. The cable is also very nice. It is made using a high purity 6N single crystal copper with an 8-strand braided design. It uses 2-pin connectors at the earpieces. The hardware looks great on the cable. The 2-pin connectors look great, and they feel very robust. The cable itself is really nice. It's soft. It has very little issues with memory, and I haven't had any issues at all with tangling. So it's a fantastic cable. Now, as far as the case, I think it's really, really nice. It looks and feels like a high quality case. It's roomy, it's very good looking. It is a semi-hard case with a really soft inner lining. It is a little on the large side, but the main things are that it's protective and it accommodates the IMs nicely, and also any other extras that you might want to bring along if you're traveling. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to sound. Okay, now as far as some of the equipment that I paired the Dawn X with, I tested these with a pretty wide range of both portable dongles, DAPs, and desktop devices, including the Ibasso DX340 here, the DX270 MK2, Hibi R6 Pro Max, Onyx XM10, and then some of my desktop devices were the FIO K19, Luxon X9, X-Duo TA32, FIO K9 Pro ESS, and then a few others, and then some dongles like the Questyle M18i and M15i. Now, if you are familiar with some of Afu's other IEMs, you'll know that they all generally follow the same kind of tuning style, which is basically kind of a neutral with a bass boost, and I guess maybe a little closer to the older 2020 IEF target as opposed to the newer meta style tuning. And that tuning style, you might see that tuning style in IEMs like the SA6 or the Da Vinci, the Cantor, Performer 8, 5+2. The Dawn X falls into that same tuning category. So again, if you're looking for that newer meta style tuning, this is not that. And I guess you could even say this is a very, very mild V-shape. In any case, what that means though, in practical terms, is that it's going to give you a slightly emphasized bass and treble presentation, but that emphasis is very mild. But to break things down a little further, we'll start with the bass, of course. Again, its bass energy is what I would consider to be slightly boosted, so it's a little north of neutral, with a good portion of that energy being focused in the sub bass and less on the mid bass. So while it will definitely give you nice amounts of impact, its presentation is going to have a more sub bass focus, so more sub bass rumble and more bass depth and less focus on the dynamics in its presentation. That said, its dynamics are still very, very impressive. And again, this uses a dynamic driver unlike the Cantor. So even though this takes kind of a similar approach to its bass tuning as the Cantor, it does actually have a little more bass energy, but you can also feel a level of physicality and viscerality that you do not get with the Cantor. And it also has a little more mid-bass energy as well. And then as you start to move out of the mid-bass into the lower mids, you do have a little bit of warmth, enough to give male vocals and instruments just the right amount of richness and weight, but without causing female vocals to sound husky. So you get the benefit of that added richness and fullness in that transition out of the bass into the mid-range, but it's not overdone. And I also feel like they did an excellent job at making sure they maintained good bass separation and control so that you don't run into issues with bass bleed. And again, at this point, we are transitioning kind of away from the dynamic drivers to the BA drivers, and they've managed to do a really good job at achieving excellent cohesion between those two driver types. And in terms of overall mid-range clarity, detail, naturalness, the vocal and instrument reproduction of the Dawn X is very, very good in my opinion. And I will get into comparisons towards the end, but I will just tell you right now, when comparing this with some of my favorite sets around this $1,000 price point, while its bass reproduction, again, without question, it's excellent and certainly worthy of this price point. But there is something extra special going on in the mid-range. And it's not just that it's really natural sounding or that it has just the right amount of richness. It has all of those qualities, however, and I might be jumping ahead a little bit here because this probably would fall under the technical heading, but there is something about its vocal and instrument reproduction that, along with that naturalness and along with that, again, that added body and weight, also comes a sense of, I guess, physicality and density, as though when I close my eyes, it's almost as though, and look, I don't want to be overly dramatic when describing my listening experiences in my reviews. And again, this is all subjective, but for me, it had a physicality to it, and it was a little more like it was occupying the same physical space that I was occupying. In other words, I felt more like I was there. And it kind of almost caught me off guard, and it took my listening experience to that next level. All that to say this, the mid-range of the Dawn X is absolutely beautiful. Now, as far as its upper mid-range energy and vocal energy, again, it's much like you would expect with this tuning approach presentation. So vocals have excellent clarity and maintain very, very good center focus, but never sound overly forward or shouty. Now, as far as its treble presentation, it does remind me a little of the Cantor. So it does have a pretty significant amount of treble energy. And as good as I felt the Cantor's treble presentation was, it was still edging pretty closely to being a little too much even for me. And the Dawn X fixes some of that. And what's interesting is I do still feel like I'm getting all the treble information and maybe even more than what the Cantor had as far as detail and air, micro nuances. The Dawn X gives me all of the good stuff. So all of the naturalness, the airiness, the details that you get with the Cantor, but it presents it in an even more refined and, I guess, just like a silky smooth way. I don't know how else to describe it. So it has no peakiness, it's not shrill, it's not sharp, there's no edge, but again, it does still have plenty of treble energy. Now, that's not to say there won't be those who might find this to be a little too much. But for me personally, I found its presentation, again, to be smoother and maybe a little easier on the ears than the Cantor. Treble extension is also very good, which means you're going to have lots of air, lots of micro details. I would, if you want a good example of a track just to use for testing that, check out Lady Be Good from Jazz at the Pawn Shop and listen to the cymbals at the beginning. Now, as far as its technical performance, this is the kind of technical performance I would expect at this price point. And it's right up there with the Diva and, dare I say, the Monarch MK3. And in my opinion, it surpasses the Cantor and FA19. And while its detail, its micro detail, and its general resolvability are certainly impressive, again, it takes vocal and instrument imaging and separation, forward layering, positional cues, and basically all those terms that you would associate with good technical performance. This does all of that very, very well. It offers an immersive and dimensional listening experience. And I have a lot of tracks that I use for testing that, but one that comes to mind is the Stripped album by Macy Gray, or also Hoff Ensemble's Innocence. Those are two pretty immersive recordings. Now, as far as comparisons, and this might be for those of you who are maybe newer to the hobby, but like any hobby, the law of diminishing returns is inevitable. So the benefits diminish as you spend more money. So if you're jumping up from, say, a $400 IEM like the Pilgrim, while there is definitely a jump up in both tuning refinement and technical performance, whether or not that increase is significant enough to justify the additional cost for you, that will obviously vary from person to person. That said, I personally feel like these IEMs are worth the extra cost, while also acknowledging that not everyone may agree with me. That said, as far as comparisons, I've got some of my favorites on the desk here, and these range from about $800, that would be the Cantor, up to the Diva, which is $1,500. And I know there are a lot of other sets out there, newer, great sets out there in this price range, but for me, these are some of my favorites because they not only offer something a little different in their tuning approaches and also bring pretty impressive levels of technical performance, but beyond that, they also each bring something special to the table that helps me connect with my music on a deeper level. For example, the Dawn X, again, it gave me a little more of an immersive experience that almost made me feel like I was in the Jazz at the Pawn Shop recording. And not every IEM does that for me, but pretty much all of these on my desk here do to one degree or another. Now, as far as some differences in the different tuning approaches each of these take, because I know that there are those of you out there that are curious, and I'll go ahead and start with the Diva. The Diva with the bass dial on the white dot, or the middle setting. That's the middle bass setting, so it's not the most, not the least, it's right in the middle, and that's my preferred setting. That's going to have a little less bass overall than the Dawn X, and is also going to have just a little more upper mid-range energy than the Dawn X. But then the Dawn X seems to have a little more lower treble energy above 5K. I think probably, if I had to guess, between 5K and 8K. In any case, though, the Dawn X is going to have just a little more treble energy than the Diva, above 5K, but both are going to have good extension and good air. For me personally, I'm still a little more drawn to the Diva's tuning, although if I'm being honest, on any given day, I might be just as likely to reach for the Dawn X because it has its own unique draw that is almost equally appealing to me. And then the Dawn X compared with the Monarch MK3, the Dawn X is going to be a little warmer, a little more relaxed in the upper mid-range and lower treble, and maybe not as much upper treble present as the Monarch MK3. Between the two, I think the Monarch MK3 comes a little closer to my tuning preference, although on a technical level, I'm having a really difficult time determining whether one is better than the other. Both are very detailed, very resolving, both have excellent imaging, layering, separation, and forward depth. Now, compared with the Cantor, again, we're comparing BA bass in the Cantor against the dynamic driver bass, the Dawn X. Not only are you going to have a little more bass presence in the Dawn X than the Cantor. That base is also more impactful. It's more visceral in its presentation than the Cantor. And then along with that extra base energy, the Dawn X also has a little more upper mid energy. And to me, overall, again, it just makes the Dawn X a little more engaging than the Cantor. And anyone who is familiar with the Cantor also knows it has a pretty, we already kind of talked about this, but it has a pretty significant amount of treble energy. Some would even say bordering on or even actually aggressive. I feel like it is a lot, but it is still pretty refined. And to me, it doesn't have any harshness or sharpness. So while it certainly has a lot of energy, I still feel like the drivers in the Cantor, they still maintained good control. And the Dawn X also has some pretty significant amounts of treble energy, but it refines that even further. And dare I say, it also has a smoothness to it. And again, I would even say silky smooth, because yes, that treble energy is there, but there is nothing about it that feels sharp, edgy, or harsh. It's very detailed, with, again, a lot of micro nuances and really good resolvability. It's natural sounding, it's airy, and frankly, I guess I don't have anything to complain about with the treble presentation of the Dawn X. And I am much more likely to reach for the Dawn X over the Cantor. I love the Cantor, but I'm finding that my connection with the Dawn, again, the Dawn X is just a little bit stronger. Now, as for whether or not the Dawn X gets my recommendation, to me, even at this higher price point, I have no reservations giving this a recommendation, because in my opinion, in terms of its sonic performance, it offers everything that I would expect to get from a flagship IEM. And I have to say, this seems to be what Aful does. Again, this is their first IEM in this price range, and they're going up against the big boys now. And I have to say, I feel like they knocked this out of the park. Is it the IEM to beat at this price point? I don't know if I would go that far. However, it certainly throws blows with some of my favorites here on my desk. And again, for this being Aful's first foray into the $1,000 plus price point, I really feel like they did an excellent job. So that concludes my review of the Aful Dawn X. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch. If you like my content, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you would please like this video, please share this video. I hope you have an awesome day.